We are very privileged to have three incredible experts on the panel this morning, and they'll each provide some commentary and introductory remarks from their perspective, and then we'll move into a discussion in Q&A. We'll keep those remarks to around 5 to 10 minutes each so that we have plenty of time for you all to ask your burning questions. So without further ado, our three panellists today include Chlöe Swarbrick, Kate Butler-Wilson and Kristy Harrison. And I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to introduce them before we launch into the discussion. So Chlöe probably doesn't need much of an introduction, but she is co-leader of the Green Party and Member of Parliament for Auckland Central. She's also the party's spokesperson for climate change, finance and revenue. Chlöe entered Parliament as a Green Party list MP in 2017 and has been the MP for Auckland Central since 2020, becoming the second Green Party MP ever to win an electorate seat. Kate Butler-Wilson, Wilson Butler, is Director of Climate, Sustainability and ESG at Chapman Tripp. She advises clients on all aspects of these areas and specialises in the intersection between climate and ESG policy, law and strategy. She has an incredible background. She was previously Head of Climate Action at the Sustainable Business Council, and prior to that was at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, where her roles included lawyer on international environmental and trade matters, diplomat, climate change negotiator, and private secretary to the Minister of Climate Change. And our third panellist is Kristy Harrison, sitting next to me. Kristy is Senior Principal International Advisory at Stantec. She has over 20 years of experience in environmental and social risk management, provides technical leadership in areas of infrastructure development and climate finance across the Indo-Pacific region. So with that, I'd like to welcome our first panellist, Chlöe, to share some of her perspectives.
Kia ora te whānau. Thank you for having me. Always a danger when you introduce a politician as an expert. I think you've all probably seen that you don't need to pass an IQ test in order to be in our parliament. To that effect, I guess I just wanted to take a step back and offer that, any politician who stands in front of you and says that they know everything is either lying to you or completely lacking self-awareness, and I'm not sure which of those two things is worse. So I'm not pretending to have all of the answers, but what I can say is that we do our utmost to engage directly with experts and with communities with lived experience in order to try and represent those things in Parliament to push ahead to try and get the kind of outcomes that I think New Zealanders deserve. So the first point that I would make is, as the MP for Auckland Central and as Auckland Central hard representative, a few years ago, I was confronted with a bunch of TV cameras in the midst of Cyclone Gabrielle. And at that point in time, I had spent several years trying to figure out how to articulate to people the evidence and the data and the reality of the climate crisis that was unfolding. But then all of a sudden you're confronted with a climate change charged weather events, and people are helping people rip out their carpets and their curtains as their lives and livelihoods are destroyed. And I think that kind of dichotomy of experience, the slow-moving crisis and the crisis they're immediately confronted with, actually kind of summarize the policy issue that we're dealing with really, really well. New Zealanders do mobilise, and people all across the world do mobilise when we are hit with an immediate disaster or crisis. We get the helicopters out, neighbours help neighbours. We're not doing arbitrary means testing of who we decide is worthy of that help. But then when we take a step back and we look at, again, the evidence with regard to the climate crisis, I think particularly in the current political and socioeconomic context that we're dealing with right now, things become far, far, far more fraught. And here I'd invite us to reflect on the experience of COVID-19, where all of the things that we were told for so long were economically or politically or fiscally impossible, direct payments to people who needed them, rent freezes, flexible working arrangements for people with disabilities or single parents, all of those things happened effectively overnight. It showed us that these things were always a matter of political willpower, and in fact, those socioeconomic and political and fiscal constraints are self-imposed constraints. Those things are made up. And this is part and parcel of what the Greens have done this morning with releasing our alternative fiscal strategy, is to show people that part of the fiscal straitjacket that we've put ourselves within over the last 40 years as a result of the advent of the Public Finance Act and a bunch of other stuff that I won't get into the weeds of today, but it is just to really illustrate the point that the rules, oftentimes the kind of area that I operate within in Parliament, that stuff is made up. But that informs a bunch of stuff that is not made up. The amount of carbon dioxide that is in our atmosphere, the health of our kids and our rivers and our waterways and our air and our soil. So the question really then is, how do we create rules that actually meaningfully reflect the world that we live in and the kind of world that we want to create? Because this thing that we call the economy is just all of us. And the planet that we live on, the things that we create, and the rules that we decide to put in place in order to try and govern those relationships. So to that effect, climate change really is the ultimate group project. And I use that analogy because I think a lot of us will think back to school or to university, where all of us would have had the experience of being on group projects where a bunch of other people are not particularly interested in doing the work. But at the end of the day, we are going to have to turn in that group project, and we fail or we pass regardless of who ended up doing that work. Climate change, however, is the ultimate group project because it is about our survival as a species on planet Earth as we know it. And this is where we get into the bigger picture of the likes of the Paris Agreement, where obviously, 190 odd countries have come together and said, this is what we are going to do ostensibly to try and get to that point of staying below 1.5 degrees of warming. And I think if we're to be completely honest and frank with ourselves, a lot of countries are not doing very well at that at the moment. So to come back down to the domestic level, the reality of the situation that we're confronted with the moment, you will all be somewhat familiar with the Zero Carbon Act that was obviously passed kind of under the leadership of my forebear, the Honourable James Shaw, as the Minister of Climate Change and former co-leader of the Green Party under the former Labour-led government, which set in place a framework whereby we were going to get to net carbon neutrality by 2050, and there were a bunch of stepping stones there with emissions budgets and emissions reduction plans to get to those budgets. Folks may know that our current government, as of last week, I believe, is currently being sued by a number of climate experts on the basis that when it came in, it shredded a bunch of policies under the emissions reduction plan number 1, which were successful without which were shown to be successful and efficient, without consulting with the public. The second emissions reduction plan from the government, and look, I'm not here to indoctrinate you guys, you're all far too smart for that, so take on board. This is very clearly my position, my perspective, but I think it's relatively evidence-based, that the government's emission reduction plan 2 is not worth the paper that it's written on. There's kind of 2 key factors in that. One is that fully a third of their emissions reduction plan relies on carbon capture and storage technology, which is technologically, relatively, and definitely economically unfeasible. The sector themselves have come out and said that over the last few weeks. And another third of it relies on waste minimisation, which in the government's most recent budget, they cut a bunch of the funding for. On top of that, people may know that in the May budget from the government, they also allocated $200 million for new oil and gas exploration and an equity stake in that, which we have very strong cause to believe is potentially in breach of our UK and EU FTAs, but also the ACCTS, another international agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability. So we're doing some work behind the scenes on that to try and hold the government to account when it comes to actually meeting these metrics on paper, let alone the real world reality of climate mitigation and adaptation. But to leave us in a place of hope, yes, it is entirely feasible that we confront the climate crisis and that we transform our society. We've done these kinds of things in the past. I think the unfortunate reality right now, as articulated a lot by people a lot smarter than me, is that I think given our current mindset and the way that we've naturalized and normalized the current economic order, is that it is easier, quote unquote, to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And I think that as we try and talk about the climate crisis right now, definitely my experience in trying to get this stuff in the news is that the media just doesn't have the bandwidth because people are more concerned about their cost of living. But we need to help people understand that these two things are deeply interconnected. And I think that that was best summarised by Jeanette Fitzsimons, one of the founding co-leaders of the Green Party, who said that we have an economic system at present that exploits both people and the planet. But we do not live in a game of monopoly. In fact, the game of Monopoly, first invented under the guise of titled The Landlord's Game by a woman called Elizabeth McGee in the late 1800s, early 1900s, was intended to teach children about the pitfalls of an economy that was designed around land speculation and luck. Unfortunately, we didn't seem to learn that lesson. But in the 1930s and the advent of some of the worst atrocities known to mankind and the Great Depression, we created the welfare state, public healthcare, public housing, public education, and we did so by levying taxes on those who had profited handsomely during a time of hardship for many. We have rallied our collective ambition in the past, and we can do it again, but it's going to take all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kate.
What an act to follow. Thanks, Chlöe, for your comments, and thank you for having me. Kia ora. Koutou katoa, ko Kate Wilson-Butler tōku ingoa. Real privilege to be here speaking to you today, and also slightly shirk that title of expert, but really happy to offer some observations from where I sit. So I'm going to take that glass half full baton and run with it, exploring the art of the possible. And so, spoiler alert, my short answer to this question of whether climate change is an insurmountable challenge will be yes, I believe. No, I believe it's not an insurmountable challenge, sorry. Apologies. Keep you on your toes. It's surmountable. And I don't think I could get out of bed in the morning and do my job if I believed that it was an insurmountable challenge. But climate change as a challenge faced by our species is unprecedented, it's existential, and it is wicked. And it's not just wicked, it's super wicked. In fact, it's not just super wicked. Someone with a much bigger brain than myself once described it as a million wicked problems, all of which need to be solved at once if we're going to tackle this thing. So against that backdrop, I wanted to offer three key thoughts. The first is not overlooking just how far humanity has come in fighting the climate crisis, particularly in the 10 years since the Paris Agreement was signed. Secondly, acknowledging the current geopolitical backdrop and the headwinds that represents, but also the slightly controversial opinion that this also represents opportunity for our region, for leadership. And third, slightly dovetailing, I think, with some of Chloe's comments that we're not going to get there with business as usual attitudes or approaches. So tackling each of those in turn. Firstly, I think zooming out from today, this conversation, and where we are in 2025, it is really easy to overlook just how far we have come. If you take the Paris Agreement and what it represented, a catalytic signal, really, from global governments who, as Chloe pointed out, came together really for the first time as the 192, I think, countries that signed that document, sending a signal to the world, to the global economy, that this is what we're pointing our machine at, right? It's 2 degrees, aspirations towards 1.5, and all of the nuts and bolts that go along with that, including adaptation and aligning financial flows towards those outcomes. So the private sector, in particular the financial sector, have in the intervening decade taken that signal and run with it. If you look at what's happened globally with the energy transition, easy to miss because we're down here with our comfortable 80-odd% of renewable generation in our system. But you have these wonderful hockey stick graphs that come out of the reports from the International Energy Agency showing uptake of key renewable technologies globally, including EVs, most of that driven out of China, which I'll come back to, but also renewable development and deployment internationally as well. And so that's huge progress, and in such a short amount of time. Another key indicator, the rise of climate-related financial disclosures. New Zealand was first in the world under the Honourable James Shaw to implement that legislation, but certainly not the last. We have now 55% of global GDP covered by that kind of regulation, which sounds a bit boring. Financial reporting, why would you be talking about that in a climate change conversation? But actually designed to address the systemic risk to the financial system represented by climate change risk that was not disclosed, not understood, not reflected on balance sheets, and therefore not being responded to by investors globally when they're deciding where and how to allocate their capital. So huge shifts there. So I really like the quote from Catherine Hayhoe, and I'm going to butcher it. It's something like, we're halfway up the mountain. We deserve to pause, take a breath, look at how far we've come. The view is awesome, but also look up. That's where we've got to go. And it's a steep and craggy climb, and we don't have very long to get there. And it all just got a whole lot harder, which brings me to my second point, the geopolitical backdrop. I think it would be a bit Pollyanna-ish to not acknowledge just how challenging this has all become particularly in the last year, but arguably since the first Trump administration as well. And certainly, I mean, I'm no longer inhabiting the world of the multilateral climate change process, but I can imagine that that process has become a lot more frustrating. You have the US re-withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, if that's even a word, no longer getting any climate finance from US as a major donor. In fact, no US aid program at all anymore. And so certainly that challenges that particular dynamic, but I don't think it tells the full story. And from where I sit, what I observe certainly in the clients that I'm working with in New Zealand and internationally, it's a story of quietly getting on with it. And that's largely because the economics of it makes sense, right? You have all of this climate risk that we've done all this work to understand and disclose. And fiduciaries, which include boards of directors and investors, asset managers, are duty bound to take into account those risks when they're making decisions. And so you're having companies and you're having investors across portfolios that consist of investment in those companies taking into account climate change and broader environmental, social issues when they're making decisions. And I think that that's critical. That's a story that's not really told very widely or understood very widely. And even if you look at the data around how companies are behaving post-US election, you're actually seeing companies leaning into increasingly setting, not at the same rate they were pre-election, but continuing to set emissions reduction targets and continuing to deliver on achieving those targets. So if you look under the hood, there's actually a different story to be told. And I think what's really interesting from the geopolitical perspective is the power plays that are being made for the title of new green superpower, right? The US has now vacated that role. It's up for grabs. You see a few moves being made by China with their announcement that they intend to publish an ambitious new nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. All countries' NDCs are due, second NDCs are due this year. They've blown through their 2030 solar installation target last year, 1,200 gigawatts of generation capacity. So increasingly, I think, and there are those in the room, I can see some familiar faces who are much more expert in these issues than myself these days, but a reshuffling, I think, of the global order in this regard, with the BRICS increasingly emergent and a role to play. And that's where I come to the opportunity for our region. Australia, opportunity to host COP31 next year, presents an opportunity for New Zealand to demonstrate leadership and to bring our region, the Pacific, along as well. That's where I get to the but. the but, we won't get there doing what we have always done. And we're clearly not on track. Any climate scientist will tell you that. While we've come very far, and we don't know what progress technological leaps may be able to unlock in the coming years, we've also got new challenges emerging, right? Lots of discussion at the moment about AI and that energy consumption of AI and that eating up basically all of the new renewable generation capacity that's being installed. So I think this is where my comments kind of align with Chloe's, in that addressing those million problems and the new million problems that are being added to the list of million problems relies on different ways of thinking, different ways of interacting. It's that group project that Chloe referred to. Many of the challenges require systemic shifts and a fundamental rethink in terms of how the global economy is wired. And humans, I think, are not wired. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but I think it's well established that humans are not wired or programmed to respond very effectively to slow-moving, far-off risks. And so, as Chloe mentioned, we're in this pattern of responding when an event occurs, rather than being able to create a long-term vision to plan for the future that we want to create. Which is why I think a much more compelling narrative is thinking about the upside of all of this, what we have to gain as a society, as a species, really, if we effectively respond. And I think the economics of that are increasingly bearing out. So is climate change insurmountable? No, it's not. We are slowly but surely turning the proverbial tanker, but it's wickedly complex and time is running out. We can tackle climate change and realise the benefits of that if we are willing to rethink the way we are approaching these issues and work more effectively together, I think.
Thank you so much, Kate. Kristy?
Thank you, ladies. Morena, everyone. Ko Kristy Harrison toko ingoa. So I agree that climate change is a challenge, but it is not an insurmountable challenge. And in fact, I even have a problem with the title of our session today, because quite often climate change is talked about in quite a negative light. It's time to turn that conversation around into positives. It's not a climate problem, there are climate solutions. Before our session began, I was starting to talk to Chloe. I'm really glad to see some students in the room, because even when I was at school, I always wanted to change the world. And admittedly, I still do. And in my job, I do it one project at a time. And this is how to eat an elephant. Climate change is a problem, but tackle it one bite at a time. And so what role does New Zealand have to play in climate change, particularly in the international space? Well, first and foremost, we have a role to maximise our position and also the impact of our investments. So the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade is a relative minnow compared to the likes of China, Australia, and the Asian Development Bank. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a role to play. We just need to make sure that we maximise where we are investing and the partnering that we do overseas. So Australia, China, ADB, they have deep pockets. They can fund these mega infrastructure projects. But New Zealand has a very good role in things like front-end strategies, feasibility studies, working at the grassroots of projects. So rather than the mega hydropower dam, the smaller microgrid projects. And that's where we can have a great impact on the ground. So helping countries to identify and manage their climate risks, look at projects that the countries themselves want to do, not that as a country we want them to build. There's no surprise that there is a lot of investment at the moment in ports, airports, because defence is a big focus in the Asia-Pacific region at the moment. We should stay apolitical if we can, and help countries operationalise their own development strategies, and alongside that to manage their climate risks. How do you do that? Well, there's actually three streams. One is mitigation, so trying to reduce, for example, CO2 emissions. Two is adaptation, so if you are having rising sea levels, more frequent storm events, you look at adaptation. And then, and a lot of the countries that I work in are actively looking at relocation. I'm doing a project in the Republic of the Marshall Islands at the moment. They have an average elevation above sea level of 2 metres. That's hard. So small island developing states are really at the forefront of this problem. And regardless of the world order and some recent, political shifts in some of our allies, some people don't even want to talk about climate change. Even if you don't mention climate change, these are economic risks, and for some countries, risks to their actual existence. And yes, New Zealand does have a role to play, particularly in the Pacific, but also, as the preceding session illustrated, we also have a role to play in Asia as well. So secondly, it's about leveraging public and private investment in this space. So the private sector, and sorry, Chloe, capitalism is not dead. Unfortunately. But the private sector actually has a real integral part to play. So international development is moving from traditional grants and loans towards facilitating the private sector. So, in fact, the public sector should not be funding projects that the private sector can do themselves. However, sometimes there are things that the public sector can do to facilitate private sector investment coming in. This can be through syndication, where the public sector provides a proportion of funding, and that then crowd in investment from other public and private banks. Insurances or guarantees, so that reduces the risk for the private sector, and things like green bonds. So there's also a recognition that there is plenty of investment for climate-ready infrastructure projects, but those projects are actually really difficult to find. And hence, that goes back to my previous point. Make sure you've got the feasibility studies, the investment priorities sorted out so that you can go to the private sector and say, we want to do these projects, can you help us fund this? And then it is a relatively easier road. I already mentioned about aligning with country priorities. And that's why continuing support for regional agencies such as PRIF, the Pacific Regional Infrastructure Facility, they help countries to set their country strategies for the development of infrastructure and related projects. The Asian Development Bank helps with legal and structural reforms to provide a more attractive investment for the private sector to come in, and or for the public sector to be able to work more efficiently to deliver projects on the ground. You've also got the likes of SPRAP and SPC that balance and work in this space as well. And there is also another point, and this relates to there does need to be a balance between economic growth and balancing of ESG risks, so environmental, social, governance risks. So particularly in the Pacific, where you've got very limited funds, avoid gold plating projects. So sometimes I've seen projects, they've brought in international engineering firms, sometimes local. They're designing to specifications which says, okay, we're building a bridge, we need to have a 100, sometimes even longer, return interval flood. So you end up with this massive structure that's completely over-engineered for the fact that this might be a rural road. It might have a dozen cars a day, some people and some goats. You don't always, managing investment and climate investment isn't always about designing to the nth degree. It's about right-sizing the project to the situation. Sometimes you're much better to build a road that's going to get flooded a few times a year and have another road, enough funds to build another route elsewhere. That is also a climate resilient solution. I've already mentioned about balancing the role of the public and private sector. Some of the international institutions come in with very stringent rules for projects to adhere to that companies struggle to implement in a developed context, let alone in a developing country context. We need to make sure we're using efficient use of funds. And some of these, particularly related to environmental and social safeguards, can be implemented by a duality of the public and private sector. You've got things like, if you're doing a project which affects a river, for example, you may need to put in water supplies. Is it the role of the contractor to put in those water supplies, or the country government to put in those water supplies so that they can then, the contractor can get along and build the project? Biodiversity offsets are also really difficult to implement on some of these projects. In Asia and the Pacific, you're working in some of the most biodiverse countries in the world, and it is really difficult if near impossible, to do development without having some environmental impact. But it's about managing those impacts, and again, maybe the role of the public sector is to, say, establish a marine reserve while the private sector builds a port. So you're balancing development with conservation, but don't necessarily put all of that cost onto the private sector, because that will blow up the budget and you won't be able to do anything else. And also, don't move your goalposts. So I've seen projects that have been delayed for several years, and every month delay in some of these projects extrapolates the cost. In conclusion, yes, climate change is a challenge, but by taking each project as it comes and working with countries to develop as they want to develop, not coming with a New Zealand philosophy or a Western philosophy of how things should be done, I think is really important. And in most Asia-Pacific countries, they want to do the right thing. The public sector wants to do the right thing, the private sector wants to do the right thing, and we can do this. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much for all your respective comments. Before I open the floor, I might take the privilege of being the facilitator. Chloe, one of the things that you said kind of just blew me away a little bit, and I've been trying to remember the movie that sort of captured this idea with
Don't Look Up.
What's that?
Is it Don't Look Up?
Yes, that one. Thank you. Could have saved myself some time there. Because it kind of captured that idea, and you said it's easier to visualize the end of the world rather than the end of capitalism. And that's just insane, isn't it?
Yeah.
But, sort of picking up, and Kate, you made sort of similar comments around, the sort of frog in the boiling water kind of scenario. How do we shift that? How do we take this from a group project where there are some people skiving off and joking around in the back to a group project where everyone is pulling their weight and doing their best?
Democracy, baby. No, but seriously, so a few things that I think it's really worthwhile unpacking in this. I actually spoke about precisely this in a different way in my maiden speech in Parliament, which was at the end of 2017, so nearly 10 years ago now. And it's the allegory of a dog standing on a riverbank and talking to a fish, because they can in this allegory. And the dog says to the fish, "How's the water?" And the fish goes, "What water?" And the idea is that some of the kind of surroundings that we take as business as usual, or just as the naturalized and normalized way that things are are actually entirely questionable. Obviously, in this instance, the water not so much, but if you think about whatever we think of when we conceptualize of the economy. And here I think that there's some incredible lessons that we can learn from very, very young people when they look around the world and go, why the hell is somebody sleeping rough out the bottom of luxury stores down the bottom of Queen Street in Auckland Central? Why are we allowing plastic to clog up our riverways and our waterways? And the best answers that we as adults kind of have is, well, that's kind of just the way that things are. But why are things that way? Well, it's to do with the assumptions that we make about this thing that we call the economy, which is why I earlier alluded to how, there are these almost naturalized assumptions about how the economy is supposed to work. And right now we do live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable, but so did the divine right of kings. That's Ursula Le Guin. And, any power that is man-made can be remade. It just requires us to understand that each of us have agency in this and not to kind of take these things for granted or as assumed. And to that effect, just to, I guess, address some of the other points that have been made, I think as in our Green Alternative Fiscal Strategy released this morning, we actually make the really salient points that McKinsey, which is an international firm, has estimated that only 40% of climate mitigation projects have a risk-return profile suitable for private investment and even fewer for adaptation projects. The report suggests that while many climate mitigation projects, while obviously crucial for addressing climate change, do not currently present a strong enough financial case for private investors. In a best case scenario that is estimated by an organisation that has a vested interest in overestimating the role of private finance, even perfectly functioning capital markets could likely provide only a third of the funding that is needed. That is the limitations of private capital. So I think it's really, really important that even in the business as usual status quo, that we are conscious of not relegating government and politics and democracy to a sector. And just to unpack that for a second, frequently when I'm talking to people about politics, they're going, oh, that's the parliament, political party, government stuff that happens down in Wellington. It's not. Politics is just about power, it's about resources, and it's about who gets to make decisions that saturate and shape our daily lives. And I find it incredibly telling that the area that we have walled off from democratic participation is this thing that we call the economy, because we have mystified it and imbued it in jargon and technocratic detail that effectively gatekeeps regular people from engaging in and understanding that this thing was not handed down to us on stone tablets. We created it and we can recreate it if the rules are not working for the majority of us because we do not live inside a game of Monopoly. So that's where, for us, we conceptualize from the perspective that I'm coming from, of a state that actually does its damn job of looking after people and people understanding that there has to be accountability feedback loops. And I guess just in closing on that point, I think some of the kind of best diagnosis of the democratic deficit that we have at the moment is that people have not seen politics working for them for so long, particularly in terms of, the crises of inequality that we have at the moment, let alone the kind of tandem crisis of the climate crisis, both of which feed into each other. To use, again, another analogy there, think of a proverbial hill and the sea levels are rising. Those who are contributing the most to climate changing emissions have the resources to continue moving further and further up that hill, whereas those who are contributing the least are those who are going to be impacted first by the climate change charged increasing water levels. But where we come back to is that people haven't seen politics working for them, so people disengage from politics. But when people disengage from politics, we get even less representation in and on the things that we care about. With that lesser representation, you end up with even less action on that stuff. And when you see less action, less people engage, less representation, less action, so on and so forth. It's a negative feedback loop, or a positive feedback loop, if you're to use that term correctly, technically. But the only way to find a fuse breaker in that is for regular people to understand that we do have power here. And I think the best way to kind of feel that is to start locally and to find a proof of concept. Find people who you do like and you do trust and start doing things, planting trees or otherwise, because that helps you understand that you can do it at a local level, which gives us a sense of faith and trust that we can scale this stuff up because we have proof of concept.
Hey,
Yeah, can I just respond? There was some mention of some big numbers in terms of investment, and the the ADB has actually quantified some of these. So the Asian Development Bank has costed the infrastructure deficit across Asia Pacific at $1.7 trillion per year. And for small island developing states, they would need to invest $5.1 billion per year just to meet adaptation targets for climate change. That being said, you can't do everything, but be positive and start one project at a time. And so set your priorities, whether it be in New Zealand or overseas, and start making a difference. Start on the ground. The rubbish problem, one of the, I've just returned from the Solomon Islands. I was looking at projects that at villages that don't even have any road access, and the biggest rubbish problem around the village, packets of 2-minute noodles. So they're light, they're easy to transport, they're easy to cook, but they're wrapped in plastic. We have accepted that it is the role of the consumer to have to deal with the packaging of products. If the companies that produce those products had to internalize the cost of disposal, they would not be wrapped in a product that takes 100 years to break down. They would be in paper or something similar, which decomposes within a matter of days. And a third point, in defence of frogs, as a biologist undergrad, the frog in the pot is actually not true. but it's commonly used.
Sorry for being unfair to the frog. Kate, did you?
Oh, yeah, just a couple of thoughts in relation to that question, Esther. And it's a good one. The goofing off students in the back of the group project. I like that visual. There's this
All
one.
been there.
Yeah, we have. There's this wonderful and therefore oft cited quote from Antonio Gramsci: "The old world is dying, the new one is struggling to be born. Now is the time of monsters." And people use it often in climate change panels because that's where we are, right? The old world is patently dying. Challenges faced by the UN system, and in fact the multilateral rules-based order in general, the time of monsters, the geopolitical backdrop to this conference. And I think I agree that the current system must and will change. Where I probably depart slightly from Chloe is I don't think any of us have a crystal ball. None of us know how that will play out, whether it will be revolution or evolution. Are we going to tear down the system that we have, or are we going to rewire it? And if we do, will we be able to do that quickly enough? But what I do concur with is that sense of agency. It's actually we humans created the system that we're operating within, and we can recreate it, rebuild it. And so that sense of agency, I think, is most powerful and can speak to all of those, even the ones goofing off in the back.
Thank you. With that, can I open the floor to questions? Couple down the back, or one at the...
Lots.
Thank you for taking my question, and this is directed at Kate Wilson Butler. I wanted to ask you about some disclosure regulations. Actually, Chapman Tripp published a report on the CSRD last December, and there was a mention of streamlining both the CSRD and the SFDR. I was wondering if you had some professional insights into that and how that could potentially look, especially since the Corporate Sustainability Responsibility Directive is kind of more directed at small to medium enterprises, and the SFDR is directed at financial market participants. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I probably must caveat this with a comment that I'm not a UK or EU qualified lawyer, and so these observations are general, and you should seek independent legal advice. You're right. We've published a few different things. One publication that we released last year for the Aotearoa Circle, who's a major pro bono client of ours, called "Protecting New Zealand's Competitive Advantage," looked at CSRD and other regulations coming out of the EU, but also the swathe of climate and sustainability reporting regulation that we're seeing across the world. I think I've mentioned that 55% of global GDP covered by these kinds of regulations now, and that at that time was a very clear advancing global trend. Fast forward a year, we have a slightly different global picture, a slightly more divergent and fragmented view. We recently ran the numbers, and whilst a year ago we had about 80% of New Zealand's exports by value going to jurisdictions and economies with those kinds of regulations enforced or proposed, it's now 70%, which is not as significant a drop as you would expect given the US, which is the major kind of deciding factor in that statistic, being our second largest export destination, has withdrawn its federal level climate disclosure rule. The reality is that at the sub-federal level, a range of US states, most notably California, who takes about a third of our exports into the US, are advancing their own state level disclosure requirements. So the reality is that that operating environment, that global landscape continues to evolve and increasingly be a benchmark against which expectations are set, whether they be of the customers of our exporting companies or the investors from which our companies receive foreign investment and direct capital. So you asked a specific question about the EU and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD. They love their acronyms over there. So yes, there has also been a change there. So the EU has or is advancing what's called the Omnibus Package, broadly aimed at increasing competitiveness. One of the proposals within that is to change some of the settings within both CSRD and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD, which is aimed more at the bigger multinationals. And that would delay its introduction, change some of the requirements, and mean that the thresholds were higher such that a smaller pool of entities would be captured. So you are seeing some shifts there too, but overall the regulations remain in place, remain proposed. It'll just likely be a slightly lighter set of requirements applicable to a smaller number of companies on a slower timeline. I could probably go into more detail, but I'll leave it there, but happy to chat afterwards as well.
There were a couple of questions at the back.
Kia ora, I'm from Dunedin, and in Dunedin there's South Dunedin, which is the most densely populated suburb in the country. It's also below sea level, and last year we had some floods which involved a number of people being evacuated from their homes. How do smaller communities and also, smaller countries navigate the problems of climate change? We can't wait for larger countries and companies to get their ass in gear, so to speak.
I'm particularly familiar with South Dunedin and the South Dunedin Futures program, and there's actually some incredible work that's come out of that project. So I believe that was prompted by, if I'm not incorrect, the 2015 mega flood that happened down there. And I was down in Aotearoa towards the middle of last year and have been many times since, but when I was getting a tour of particularly the big kind of banks that are currently obviously trying to prevent, some of the worst issues with sea level rise. And I just remember how dystopian it was standing on these man-made banks, which are built on top of landfills that contain historical munitions and chemicals, which of course there are actually many all across the country. And I believe the last time that we had a governing relationship with Labour, Eugenie did some work to survey how much it would cost to actually try and interrogate where all of these are. And this actually begs the question of the money that is needed to be invested to actually discover how much of a problem that we're looking at. Just for those historical landfills that have been filled over, we're looking at approximately $1 billion to just survey them all across the country to understand the scale of the problem. So standing on this bank, which is man-made and atop of all of these potential chemical leachates, watching as these diggers and all of this machinery were inflating what are called sand sausages to go underneath the sand on this beach, I believe St Kilda, in order to dissipate the waves as they were coming in on shore. And it was just mind-blowing looking at this and going, this is so dystopian, but it's also not a long-term solution. It's only buying slightly more time. The South Dunedin Futures project has obviously been going for several years now with the intention of trying to come up with a number of options for the community to be, behind the social license for what happens in the future, whether that be people moving, different kind of adaptation projects, and a range of other options. And as I understand it, they came to the government, particularly Minister Simon Watts, at the end of last year and asked for some funding in order to get on with some of this work, and they were turned away. So here, without getting too much into the partisan politics of it all, I can reflect on how in Finance and Expenditure Select Committee, a committee which I'm on, we ended up taking on board the climate adaptation inquiry, which originally was started under the former government at the behest of the Honourable James Shaw, and then obviously transitioned into this one, which the Finance and Expenditure Committee was charged with. To be completely honest and frank with you, and I've said this on many panels, including with the Environmental Defence Society, you don't need to really read between the lines all too much in that report to see very explicitly where we inserted a line that says that the recommendations of this inquiry are inconsistent and at times contradictory. And this is where I want to be, again, completely honest and transparent with you about the fact that all of this stuff is political. It reflects power and it reflects resources, who is expected to pay and who is willing to pay. So in that climate adaptation inquiry, and also in much of the current government's framework and rhetoric around this, they're talking about the notion of the least cost and also beneficiary pays. What beneficiary pays means is that those who are benefiting from that climate adaptation are the ones who are being expected to pay for it. But as I just alluded to in my earlier response to a question, right now, we know that those who are at the top of the pecking order in terms of the deep inequality that we have not just domestically but internationally are also those who are contributing the most in terms of climate changing emissions, whereas those who are going to be impacted first and worst are at the bottom of that pecking order. So this is where I think that actually the real ideological gap is showing itself, which is where I come back to some of those economic presumptions that we make around who is benefiting and how collectively we take on the ambition to ensure that everybody lives their best possible life. So that's why, for me, you cannot divorce the issue of environmental and climate justice from one of social justice. And just again, to put that in really contemporary and immediate terms, it's really hard to get people to care about the end of the world if they can't think about how they're going to survive to the end of the month. And this was also manifest in some of the perspectival differences that I saw sitting on the Environment Select Committee when the Zero Carbon Act was passing through back in the day. You know, we were looking at, from a public policy perspective, how do we go about, reducing climate changing emissions out 30 odd years and all the steps to get there. We had people from the agricultural and rural sector coming before us and saying, please don't do this, you'll burden us with costs, I can't afford to survive till the end of the week or the end of the month or the end of the year. We're never going to have a constructive dialogue if we're starting from those radically different perspectives on the problem, because we're not defining the problem in the same way. So, to the core question of what we do with South Dunedin, it is about resource sharing, it is about revenue sharing. And just to add a few other tiny bits to that, we had the Future of Local Government review about a year or two ago now, which reflected exactly the same thing that was found in the Productivity Commission review of the Shand Inquiry, which was reflected in the Shand Inquiry 15 years ago, all of which said that our local governments right now that are doing things like the South Dunedin Futures Report, they're also doing it in Westport, they're doing it in Nelson, they're doing it in Northland at the top of the North Island. All of our local governments are saying they do not have the resources necessary to meet their basic mandate. This was also reflected in Standard & Poor's in March, downgrading all of our local governments' credit rating because of the fact that our local governments do not have the resources necessary to do what they need to do. So central government needs to step in here and needs to do that resource and that revenue sharing, or we will continue to see these problems compound and get a heck of a lot worse.
Thanks, Chloe. Were there anyone else want to make a comment?
Well, I can, coming from the engineering lens, we are working with councils around the country in terms of how to manage these risks on a day-to-day basis. Because whatever you call it, It's a risk that needs to be identified and then you can manage it. No different from any other risks that you may encounter on a day-to-day basis. So first of all, you need to identify what the risk is. You map your flood zones, you map your coastal inundation zones. You then, and this is the difficult bit, have to determine what your values are. So what do you value most, and therefore where are you going to put what? You look at your adaptation. Do you want to raise existing houses off the ground, or say that new houses must be X meters above flood levels? Do you look at nature-based solutions, coastal setbacks, dune restoration, riparian restoration, as well as, because hard engineering solutions or a combination of both, the likes of stop banks, because nature can cope, but only to a certain extent. You also have to look at your planning regulations. So your zoning, so can you build, is it a more appropriate use of that land to build high intensity housing, or to have it as agriculture? You know, are you going to flood some crops, or are you going to flood thousands of people? And in some instances, it's about retreat. So nearly 20 years ago, I was working on Project Twin Streams in Auckland, which was all about identifying flood-prone areas, and the council at the time was actually buying flood-prone properties, moving them off and creating urban parks. And a lot of those spaces actually survived very well during the Auckland floods. We can do this. We have done it. It's just you need to identify and plan for it.
Thank you, Kate.
Just a couple of quick thoughts on that one. We talked before about tackling climate change requiring new ways of working and new ways of thinking, and I think the work of the South Dunedin Futures Programme and Jonathan Rowe and his team is really an impressive template that can be picked up and used nationwide, subject to resources. But I think one kind of broader observation, stepping back from the detail of what the challenges, the very real challenges faced by the residents in South Dunedin, is the comments that I was making earlier around the economics increasingly stacking up. Largely, almost exclusively, I'm talking about mitigation, and that's it most pertinently applies to renewables. Solar is now the most abundant and cheapest form of energy in the world. Unfortunately, adaptation and resilience projects just don't pay in the same way. And there are lots of clever people trying to figure out how you do get the economics to work there, but it just traditionally hasn't planned out that way. And that's why you see such a key role for development finance in those areas, particularly in developing countries. And so you have a bit of a case of misaligned incentives, I think, where you have local government, with a lot of the accountability, honestly, and being closest to the community, so in many ways being best placed to help develop responses, but none of the levers really, and increasingly resource constrained, right? You have insurers incentivized to act and to help mitigate and manage these risks so that they can remain engaged in a market, but also not having necessarily the full remit or ability to influence that change themselves. Banks reliant on insurance to be able to offer mortgages, and then ultimately our homeowners, our residents, holding the baby, holding the proverbial baby. And so this is one of those systemic challenges, I think, that really requires a fundamental rethink of the way in which we work, cross-sectoral, public-private partnerships to be able to really tackle this challenge and bring novel solutions, novel community-led solutions like South Dunedin Futures to life more broadly.
Thank you. Next question.
Kia ora. Thank you for your insights. It's been a really interesting panel. My name's Henry. I've got a question primarily directed at Chloe, but everyone's free to respond. Chloe, you've spoken really powerfully about the importance of democracy in our response to climate change. But if democracy reflects the will of the majority, and that majority remains deeply attached to short-term comfort, fossil fueled prosperity. Is it not possible that a democracy that enacts the will of the people might actually inhibit climate transformation? And could the belief in democratic solutions be comforting us precisely because it avoids confronting the deeper failures of the culture that we inhabit, which values anesthetized comfort and not the transcendent creation of new values?
Thank you for that question. So here I'll start by offering a reflection on when I was in my first year of undergrad philosophy studies at university. I'll be completely honest with you and tell you that I once upon a time was enamored by the idea of libertarianism, which, as those who may know, underpins one of the most right-wing parties in our parliament. The reason for that is that the rhetoric of freedom with little limitation by, potentially causing harm to others is incredibly alluring. It sounds like liberation. But then you start understanding that that freedom is illusory, it's not real if you don't have economic freedom. To say that somebody is free to choose when somebody cannot afford to put food on the table is absolute nonsense. So that is why it's really critical to understand that any form of social freedom is predicated on economic freedom. And I would argue that right now we do not have meaningful economic freedom for a vast majority of people because of wealth inequality. We have wealth inequality right now, domestically, particularly in this country, which rivals what international economists like Thomas Piketty have pointed out, kind of feudal era inequality. If you're to look at just the facts that government departments themselves have produced, the likes of the IRD and the High Wealth Individuals Report, back in like 2-3 years ago now, we knew back then, and this is prior to the inflation, whereby we now know that based on the NBR Rich list from about a week or two ago, that the wealthiest 112 families and individuals in this country are worth $100 billion. Or a few years ago, they were worth $85 billion for those top 311 households, which was more wealth combined than the bottom 2.5 million New Zealanders. And that's not an accident, but a consequence of a tax system that sees those at the top pay an effective tax rate less than half of that of the average New Zealander. And it's really interesting when we talk about this stuff as the Greens, because a lot of people kind of leap to, oh, well, if you look at just the pure monetary value that those at the top are paying, then it's still more than our firefighters or our nurses or our doctors or whatever else. But again, the point is that it's supposed to be proportionally fair. And if we are seeing our multi-millionaires and billionaires pay half the effective tax rate of the lowest income New Zealanders, that is not only fundamentally unfair, but it's depriving us of the necessary investment in our infrastructure that ensures all of us thrive and that actually our wealthiest also rely on. Typically, when we're thinking about the kinds of things that the state funds and pays for and ensures the legitimacy and validity of, we're thinking about the physical built environment and infrastructure, but we tend to neglect that it's also about the functioning of our courts, i.e. the very frameworks that the wealthy rely on to enforce their contracts, for example. So actually it's in the interests of all of us to have a functional state. So where I'm kind of getting to in all of this, and I think that we're seeing it currently most extremely exemplified in the United States with the No Kings rally over the past few days and otherwise, and obviously the rallies against oligarchy and all the rest, is that we are seeing a transition from the notion of democracy towards one where the concentration of power and wealth in fewer and fewer hands has infected our democracy. As I think well articulated by some who in this room may know as Gary's Economics, he's a former currency trader, has kind of written a book now and is pretty well renowned on social media. What he talks about is not only those at the top kind of coming for obviously more and more resources, but also for the media landscape and therefore for the ideas that we are able to discuss and for your politicians, which then means that our democracy actually is what is being constrained at the end of the day. And if I can be so forthright and transparent, obviously I'm coming from where I'm coming from. Everybody else can more than welcome to argue with me. I'll argue with anyone. But I think that we can see that in terms of the influence of lobbyists on this government at the moment. I mean, who asked for tax breaks for tobacco companies? Who asked for the underwriting and the subsidising of the fossil fuel sector? It's definitely not the average person who I talk to. So if we want to talk about democracy and the things that I hear on the ground, even from the people who most ardently oppose me, at the end of the day, when you really get to the bottom of the conversation and our values, regular people in this country care about each other and the planet that we live on. And I think that if we're stuck at this point of kind of arguing and bickering at the most polarized logical endpoints of our different ideologies, and at that point of rhetoric, we're never going to have a constructive conversation. It's much like the point that I was making about the perspectival difference between the farmer who's struggling to survive inside of the current economic model and the public policy thinking for decades into the future. If we're able to take some time to try and understand each other and come back down to what actually matters, then we're having a far more constructive conversation. So right now, actually, I think that our democracy is constrained and people are not able to fully participate in our democracy because they don't have the time or the energy or the resources to invest in understanding all of the political rhetoric that's chucked out there by politicians. And I can say hand on heart that I find that incredibly bloody frustrating because here we are trying to, you know, as nerds in the Greens, talk about the evidence and the facts and the data. I've spent the better part of a decade chucking all of that out and hoping that that'll shift people's minds, but unfortunately it doesn't. So I think that this was best summarised in at our Green Party AGM last year. I kind of had a bit of a hard talk to the troops and said, you know, there is no point being right if we are left clinging to our mountains of evidence when the last tree is cut down. What we actually have to focus on is building trust within our communities so that we can all collectively work together to actually tackle these issues. Because you cannot leave politics to the politicians or we'll get what we've always got. And what we've got is getting a heck of a lot worse at the moment.
Thank you. I think we probably have time for one more question.
Thanks very much. My name's Laura. I was wondering if the panel would be able to speak to what you see as the role of nature in making the challenge more surmountable, but also in terms of ensuring that New Zealand is well placed to meet the next frontier of international customer and market demands.
Do you want to kick?
Thanks for the question, Laura. We're talking today about climate change. I would say that a good 3 to 4 years ago, the penny well and truly dropped internationally that biodiversity loss is the twin crisis to climate change. And the two amplify one another. And that awareness evident in the global biodiversity framework that we now have at the multilateral level has also taken hold in the private sector as well. It's hot on the heels, I would say, of climate change. We had the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which gave rise to the swathe of regulation I've already referred to today. Coming fast behind it is the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, with investors, banks, other providers of capital, and indeed customers of particularly our primary exporters in offshore markets, increasingly cognizant that these companies, their balance sheets are dependent on natural capital as an input, and they're also impacting natural capital as well. And so increasingly, I think you'll see disclosures in this regard, financial related disclosures that capture the value of nature in our traditional financial reporting frameworks, but also those expectations that I talked about in market that are being benchmarked to these new disclosure regimes on climate change and sustainability, taking into account nature and the impact that supplier of goods or indeed maybe services has on the natural environment more broadly, not just on emissions. And you're seeing already moves by those in New Zealand who are ahead of the curve and see the opportunity that this represents to our economy to get out ahead of this trend. A number of examples that I could cite, but Silver Fern Farms comes to mind as one example, as a company who really sees its stewardship and custodianship of the natural environment that its farmers operate in and on which its livestock lives and eats, as being a really important input and driver of value for the organisation, and being a competitive edge for it in the markets in which it's seeking to sell. So I think that'll be the next frontier.
In one of the previous questions, I mentioned about nature-based solutions, and nature is both part of the problem and part of the solution. So over time, we have constrained nature's ability to respond to extreme events. For example, our rivers used to be able to roam across their floodplains. Now they're constrained into much narrower areas with houses built right up to their banks. That means that the houses are going to get flooded. Our dune and beach systems have been built on, and while they would naturally adapt and come inland and move with changing sea levels and as a result of storm events, they can't do that anymore. Plus, their natural dune vegetation has been stripped. Our wetlands have been drained. New Zealand's lost about 90% of our wetlands across the country. So we need to start putting some of those systems back. And in areas where we can't, we may need to augment them with engineered solutions. Like I said before, nature has a great ability to absorb and adapt to the energy of climate events, but it also has its limits. For example, low impact design and wetlands can absorb rain to a certain extent, but for really large events, you can need a combination of systems. But yeah, it's definitely an integral part.
Kia ora hoa. So a few different things. I think the first thing is ultimately, in the timescale of the planet, nature always wins. I find it really interesting that we talk about climate change as though it's about saving the planet. It's actually about saving us. Like, the planet will shake us off like a bad case of the fleas, which is, I think, kind of what we're experiencing at the moment, unless we decide to get our house in order and we ensure that we are living in tune with the climate and making it conducive to life on Earth as we know it. The second thing is that I think much to that point around how we've drained our wetlands and that we've, artificially constrained our waterways and otherwise, the keys to understanding this stuff is in the real te reo names of so many of the places around this country. I think about it in the context of Auckland Anniversary floods and Cyclone Gabrielle. Waihori to Queen Street. Waihori to Queen Street is where the water flowed down, and, we've chucked concrete over it. And again, nature's coming back. It's going to claim that space. So we have to figure out how we're going to actually work with nature. I also think that it's important here to understand that good climate adaptation is also mitigation. So nature-based solutions are actually part and parcel of that. And this is something the Greens are proud to have inserted into the climate adaptation inquiry from FEC. And what I mean by that is that when you think about the likes of nature-based solutions, whereby, they operate as carbon sinks, it is also the case that they can offer an adaptive function because they can stymie the flow of water into, for example, housing developments or otherwise. I also think that this is where it's important to look at the distinction between net and gross emissions reductions, because if you look at the plan that the government has at the moment, it is primarily focused on net reduction, i.e. through ostensibly, potentially unlimited forestry offsets, particularly the plantation of pine, which obviously is a massive issue for our rural communities. But I also think that that's a perfect example of why gamifying and commodifying existential survival is a really bad idea. But I think, again, if we were to think about it from a purely gross emissions reduction perspective, we wouldn't be seeing this kind of immense pine plantation taking over rural areas. Also important to reflect on the international conference that's currently happening on oceans. I've been talking about how we need to protect 30% of our oceans, and obviously the Greens about ending bottom trawling for time immemorial, but my dad didn't care about it until he saw the David Attenborough documentary. So I think while the public imagination is captured by imagery like that, we really do need to use that focus and mobilize that to actually get those public outcomes. And here I'd make the point to anyone who's interested in this, put some pressure on our ministers who have currently stymied the passage of the Hauraki Gulf Marine Protection Bill. And I guess the final point in all of that, which relates back to the issue of democracy, is we so often forget that we are nature. We've separated ourselves so much from whence we came, that I think it's really important that we actually do spend time in nature, that we touch grass, that we touch trees, that we get into the ocean, and we remember the inherent value of these things. Because as I was reflecting on before, the way in which we have financialized so many of the things that we care about means that we seem to know the cost of everything and the value of nothing. And I think some things hold that inherent value. And that also offers us an incredible opportunity to learn more about and to fight for te tiriti o Waitangi, because part of the reason that those who are seeking to commodify our natural world and extract as much profit as possible, the reason that they are targeting te tiriti o Waitangi is that that has served as a form of legal innovation with regard to seeing legal personhood for our maunga and for our waterways, and ultimately to prevent that exploitation and that extraction. So all of these issues, if I can leave you with anything, all of these issues are deeply interconnected.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for an incredible discussion. That time went very quickly, and so I'm sorry we have run out of time for questions, and I'm very conscious too that I stand between you guys and lunch. And as a person who gets hangry, I'm very conscious of that. So look, I just wanted to thank you all for taking the time both to sit up here and talk about these really big issues, but to all of you as well in the crowd for coming to such an important conversation, and one that is going to have to continue and continue and continue. Just very briefly, what I heard today was climate change is an incredible challenge. We do need to think a bit more positively, though, about how we frame that challenge, because we can solve it. It's not insurmountable, but it is the ultimate group project. And there are people that aren't going to pull their weight. So we need to think about how do we bring them on the journey, but also how do we create the economic space and security for everybody in our society and in our communities to think about these issues, to care about them, and to also be part of the solution. So just a really big thank you again for taking the time today, and to you all as well. Lunch is awaiting, so please join us out there, and I'm sure our panellists will stay around as well for more of a conversation. Kia ora.